Hello and welcome. My name is Kip Teitsort. I'm the founder of DT4EMS LLC, and our course line is Escaping Violent Encounters, mainly for EMS and fire. And this presentation is going to be on violence in EMS and fire. And I like to ask, is it really an issue? Is this a problem? We want to start off by saying training or preparing for self-defense is kind of like taking a bath. If you don't do something for it every day, you're going to stink. Now, a little picture here to help us with some anatomy before we go too far. Now, a lot of people know my story, but some don't. Basically, I had started this course in 1996, and I started teaching it for CEUs in 1997, and little did I know that my hobby was going to become a passion in the fall of 2000. To make a long story short, my ambulance was carjacked, and when it was all said and done, the guy was minimally charged, and there was no issue made of this. We were loaded with a patient, and the patient's daughter was also in the unit when the ambulance was carjacked, and nobody cared. So to me, it drove me crazy, because I thought, wait a minute, if this would have happened in my patrol car, everybody would have heard about it. But because it happened in an ambulance, nobody seemed to care. It was like it was part of the job. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So the goal of E.V.E., our Escaping Violent Encounters, is to prevent at least one person, that's patient or provider, from becoming the victim of an assault. And we really need to start trying to make sure people get an understanding that there is a distinct difference between a patient and an attacker. Just because you were called somewhere to somebody does not make them a patient. There's a big thing a lot of times. Here's a great example where EMS gets turned over someone by law enforcement because the officer tells the person and says, well, you can either go to the hospital with them or go to jail with me. Well, inadvertently, what happens sometimes is that now law enforcement has somewhat made EMS appear in the patient's eyes, or maybe an attacker's eyes, to be part of law enforcement, which we're really not. So not everybody you're called to is truly a patient, and this gets really in depth. I'm not talking about the confused diabetic. I'm not talking about a person who is hypoxic and has truly a medical emergency. We're talking about a person who maybe has voluntarily become intoxicated or under the influence of a drug. Just because that person is under the influence of something, because of their voluntary intoxication, does not negate any criminal activity. We don't teach a lot about martial arts, and we're not talking about law enforcement style defensive tactics that use pain compliance to obtain control. Law enforcement operates under custody and control. EMS operates in patient care via consent. They're two completely different type of things. I'm not sure if I've ever met anybody who would consent to having pain given to them. So especially when it comes to a patient. So we need to really watch that anytime we're trying to talk about pain compliance on as far as defensive tactics. It's really a play on words. We're not talking about fighting anybody. We're talking about our goal has to be escaping. We don't teach ground and pound, we teach escape skills. But like anything else in any type of self-defense system, it's going to take you some practice to become proficient. Hopefully the things that we've done, though, is really kind of ease some things up to give you more principle-based and tactic-based, not just techniques. Anytime you're talking about any class that has to do with escaping a violent encounter, you have to understand that it trains multiple areas. It must train multiple areas. If you're only focusing on a technique, you're lacking. So the reason our company is actually DT4 and the number 4 EMS is because there's 4 specific areas that we're training. We're training the mind, we're training for the street, we're training for the media, and we're training for the courtroom. So our name, Defensive Tactics for EMS as a company, is defensive because everything is non-aggressive. Tactics because it's much more than techniques. 4 because of these 4 main areas that we train: the mind, the street, the media, and the courtroom. And EMS and fire because it was for us by us for the start. And so now we get to the question: violence in EMS. Is it really an issue, and is there a need to train? What do you think? Is there a need to train for violence against you or someone attacking you on the job? Well, let's see. This is a screenshot of our forums. If you go to DT4EMS.com forums, you can see it here. This is just one page. Notice some of the stories here. Arkansas, a man arrested after running down and killing a firefighter. Here's a female medic that was stabbed 6 times in the station. EMS worker suddenly dies after struggling with an agitated teen psych patient. And then we have some shooting issues. Not everybody was killed. Some were shot and killed, some were not. Here's a man punches EMT in the face for being too slow. Arizona, a psych patient assaults EMS and escapes the ambulance. Homeless man arrested for allegedly punching a Hoboken EMT and a worker in the face. Guys, we have like 34 pages of this. I think there's 25 on each page, and there's like 34 pages. This is just stuff that people have made me aware of that actually made the news. And I can tell you, everywhere that I go traveling across the country and teaching, that anecdotal stories fill the room of where people have been punched and kicked and spit on, but yet they haven't made police reports. So we have to start seeing that we need to make some changes with that. Here's just a screenshot from a paramedic that was injured by being attacked on the side of the road, or actually in her ambulance. Here is a one out of where a firefighter is about to get punched. Let's take a quick look at this picture though. If you notice, there's some things about this guy's face that we're going to cover a little bit later, but you can see multiple things that we talk about on how this attack actually was able to occur. Here you can see the punch has now happened. Now what about this one? What do you think's about to happen here? You guessed it. Now, we see this one, it's kind of funny. Whether or not this is a legitimate image, I can't source this shot, I don't know, but we can see here this comes from LA. Looks like this guy's got multiple taser darts, and where is law enforcement? So again, I don't know if this is real or not, but the point is we've dealt with this kind of a guy before on our job. So is there a need to train? Let's take a look at this image for just a minute. And I know what you're thinking. Well, why in the world is Kip showing us pictures of police officers wrestling with a bad guy on the side of the road? Multiple reasons for showing you this series of images. First of all, let's take a look. Whose arm is that, and what is it attached to? And if you had any question about what it's attached to, look right here on the ground. That would be the magazine from the officer's weapon. Okay, two officers, here's a bad guy. Let's take a look at the next shot. Just kind of a close-up to see he's still attached. The officer's trying to retain his weapon. Uh-oh. This would be why Kip is showing this series of images. Who's this guy? Yep, because he's wearing gloves. That's a firefighter paramedic. Notice the expressions on the faces here and the expression on the face here on the bad guy. Now, look what's happening. Two officers doing what they're taught primarily in the academy, which is weapon retention in a grappling situation. The weapon must stay in its holster. All except the bad guy has, there's a failure of a golden training rule here, which is the bad guy now has the back, meaning he's to the back of the officers. But unfortunately here the paramedic who thinks he's helping is actually hurting the situation because he is now tying up the officer to keep him actually preventing from being able to spin in. The interesting thing of this is a whole training concept that comes in, meaning people revert back to training. So these guys are going back to Academy 101, which is weapon must stay in its holster. The unfortunate problem is when you read our Race to React, you can check that out on the website, Race to React, you'll understand that why there's a problem here. Their brain is focused on keeping the weapon in the holster and nobody's touching the bad guy. So in a sense, that was basically a minor crash, and when the troopers began to ask for information, the guy jumped up and started fighting for the officer's gun. But that, of course, could never happen to you. No situation like that could ever occur with you. So my question I start to ask you, how many more before we train differently? How much more is it going to take before we change the way we train our people from the moment they enter into school? So basically I'd like to say that, escaping violent encounters is training for when the scene is not as safe as you thought it was. Because if people were not being assaulted on unsafe scenes, they're apparently being assaulted on safe scenes. So this widely recognized but little acknowledged problem of injury through assault that goes on, whether it be through drug use, intoxicated patients, assault calls, whatever, why is this widely recognized but there's no real acknowledgement to it? Well, I think there's actually several reasons. First of all, I think it's a failure to report actual incidents of assaults to law enforcement or supervisors. This theory that it's just part of the job. And then one that really gets me is this mocking by senior staff, where people make fun of somebody that actually wants to report the incidents. So I often ask people, what kind of work did you do before you got into EMS and fire or the healthcare industry? And when you think about it, was it okay to be assaulted on that job by a drunk or a druggie? And if it wasn't accepted there, why is it accepted in ours? And since 1997, 96 created, been teaching this since 97, trying to share the information, I've been trying to not act like a bull in a china shop. It's been baby steps trying to get people to change the culture of safety in EMS. So as we go through some of these studies kind of quick, the real thing that I want you to look at is just the dates. Don't worry so much about all the little ends of it, but just check this out. Look how many people are studying this. So in 2002, Wyoming did a study showing their people had been assaulted. Why did they do a study? Because apparently there's a problem. So I start asking, how many more studies is it going to take before we change? Now, in 1995, Missouri did a study showing that 14% of their people had reported assaults in the 6 months prior to the survey. In 2001, John Eric published an article in EMS Mag, which is now EMS World, that said Chicago EMS reports an average of 3 assaults per day. How many more is it going to take? In 2005, the Boston Herald published an article called EMTs Under Siege, Attacked by the People They're Trying to Save. Jessica Heslin put this one out, and they came up with this number saying that they believe there were 700,000 annual assaults on EMS providers a year. Well, how in the world did they come up with that? They came up with it through the NAEMT study. And here's some of those things that were released with that. According to the NAEMT study that was done with McNeil Pharmaceuticals, it said more than 1 in 2, 52%, had been assaulted by a patient. 1 in 2, that's 50%, had been exposed to an infectious disease. But almost 1 in 2, that's 47%, had sustained a back injury while performing EMS duties. Then you go, but only 1 in 5 have actually contracted an illness from a patient, and only 1 in 5, 21%, rank their personal safety as a top concern. Now I ask you, when we go back one, what was the leading cause of injury according to the NAEMT? Assaults. But yet we have all these other things that we do, but we're not training for assaults. We've got bloodborne pathogen stuff, we got body substance isolation, we have to wear our seatbelts, and now we wear fancy reflective vests. We got all these other things for what is all the other types of injuries, power cots, proper lifting and moving training, all the stuff that goes on, back testing. But yet we're still not handling what we need to do for the stuff that goes on more often than not, which are assaults. So I say that, you know what, it's this, service to everybody else. Service before self is why I think that only 1 in 5 rank their personal safety as a top concern, because I think that EMS is similar to law enforcement and, firemen and soldiers, where they want to put everybody else's safety first. That can be kind of dangerous. But how many more is it going to take? Bureau of Labor Statistics in '99 showed that basically that what they said was that there's this rate of 8.3 assaults per 10,000 that is significantly higher than the rate of non-fatal assaults for all other private sector industries. A white paper was written that said a healthcare provider is more likely to be assaulted on the job than a police officer or prison guard, based on those numbers. Emergency Nurses Association 2007 found that more than half of their emergency nurses faced physical violence on the job. And Dr. Brian McGuire did the largest study ever, on the EMS side, and basically what he found was that the relative risk is 22 times higher than that of the national average. 22 times. So how many more flippant studies, surveys, and news reports, injuries is it going to take before we change the way we train? OSHA said, you know what, employer? We believe the the general duty clause applies, that the employer should be making it a little bit safer for you as an EMT, a paramedic, or a fireman on the job due to violence. So again, training for back safety, pass for the firemen, or I'm sorry, for the fire extinguishers in hospital and around the station. Bloodborne pathogens, but only 21% get sick. So why aren't people not training for protection when yet 52% have been injured on the job? Agencies aren't taking it serious. Training institutions are not taking it serious. Administrators are not taking it serious. How many more injuries is it going to take before we train differently? Now, here's pretty interesting. Why is it that if an employee makes a medication error, we retrain them? But yet, if an employee makes an error on a self-defense thing, we fire them. I think that this is pretty interesting. I go a lot more in depth in this on a live presentation. And also, don't you think it's ironic that many administrators don't think that training their staff in escaping violent encounters is important, but that many frontline staff want to be armed with firearms? Why such a huge gap? Somebody's not connecting. When you continue to talk about the difference between a patient and attacker, we need to start understanding that there's a difference between an aggressor and a patient. So an aggressor is basically a person who commits an assault. An assault is a threat or an attempt to strike another, whether successful or not, provided the target is aware of the danger. Reasonable. This is what you guys have got to get. In law terms, it's rational, it's appropriate, or usual under the circumstances. Self-defense is this use of reasonable force to defend oneself or another from bodily harm of an aggressor or an attacker. Too many times people use things like whack somebody in the head with an O2 bottle, or I'll just do whatever it takes to go home, I'll do this or I'll do that, but they won't really define what it is. Guys, I can make a mistake in my use of force in self-defense, but as long as my actions were reasonable, I'm okay. Well, if you don't really start defining what reasonable is for people, they're going to continue to make mistakes. Stay tuned, and we'll cover part 2 in the next one.